Hey, I'm here today joined with Craig Harding, director at Riverside Farm Institute here in Zambia. Thanks for joining me, Craig.
Yeah, glad to be here. Good to do this again.
So, yeah, Craig is a return guest on the podcast for a number of reasons. One of which because Riverside Farm Institute is one of my largest clients here in Zambia, and also because Craig keeps showing up when with things to talk about, and when we in the past when we were podcasting and he shows up and we're like, hey, let's see what's going on in Zambia. And now, of course, fast forward now, here I am as well. So we're actually both in Zambia, but we what I wanted to do is I wanted to take some time. Craig and I, it's tough when you're busy and we're farming away, and you kind of forget to stop and take time to say, where are we and what progress have we made, because there's always progress, right? There's always more to do. And so the reason what prompted this podcast is just that we came across a piece of data, of information that made us stop and say, holy smokes, um, we've done something here, and let's talk about that. And so, funny again, just to it, you get so busy in what you're doing, and I've been working on, we're making on our own on-farm organic fertilizer products here and non-organic fertilizer products here, and I hadn't even looked at our standard soil sample, and Craig says, "Hey, you have those soil samples?" Yeah, and so he starts looking at them and saying, "What about this? What about that?" And so I started looking as well, and then I said, "Oh my goodness, what about this? What about that?" So what is that, Craig, that all of a sudden was the elephant in the room that blew us both away?
Yeah, I mean, here in this part of Africa, it's just a real struggle to grow organic matter. And so you'll talk to guys doing cover crops, no-tilling, plowing them in, all kinds of different things. And, pretty much the only person that I know of who's gaining organic matter in this region has been somebody putting on bulk compost in their fields. And not everybody has the capacity to do that or the time to do that or the inputs to do that easily. And so it's been a struggle. Like, we got active biology, you got cover crops, you've got all this stuff going on. But if you can't move the organic matter dial, what do you do? And so a lot of us have just kind of resigned that maybe that's not the measure here. Maybe we just, the heat that we have without a winter cold season to speak of, we can't move the organic matter the same as, say, Gabe Brown in North Dakota, or, some of the guys we would highlight. And so when we got that soil sample, um, for years we've been doing the soil samples, and you'll see a 0.5% movement over a couple of years, one way or the other. And never really a sustained movement in organic matter. And you're doing the right thing. You're doing cover crops. You're moving towards no-till. You're seeing more structure, but that number's not moving. And for us, it's huge, especially like this year, we're in a massive drought, and so you want to chase that organic matter number because you want the water holding capacity, and it's massive. But we just haven't ever cracked that nut. And so when we got these soil reports and started going through them, there's a lot of interesting stuff in them, obviously, like every time if you dig into soil reports. But the thing that really stood out was between our two center pivots and our banana fields, our different established plantations, was the movement of organic matter finally in the last couple of years. And so what we saw there was, massive increases. I'd say a minimum of about 40% increase in organic matter over the last testing. And in some cases, like the one pivot, which I would normally say is our less quality pivot, shallower soils, literally moved 100%. And so, like, those are big numbers for us. I would have been excited about a 0.5% movement. And so seeing that was like, wow, okay, let's talk about what we did. And so I think that kind of got us kicked up into thinking, okay, we liked what we were doing, but what was it that really moved the needle?
Yeah, so I mean, spoiler alert, we saw increased organic matter of 1 to 2%, which is a 50 to 100% increase. And I mean, honestly, while there are things we always want to take soil samples because we want to measure everything we can measure and make our recommendations based off of those. Absolutely, especially for soluble nutrients like nitrogen. But quite honestly, as an agronomist, oftentimes, I've carefully watched soil samples to my dismay, not seeing that number move, not seeing organic matter move much, and being frustrated. So it's not one that I look at in expectantly seeing something to move. So when you look at that number, because you always do, you glance back down and say, wait a minute, what has happened? And to see numbers that large, of course, the immediate phone call I make after that is, are my field techs to say, okay, tell me, tell me what your sampling methods were, please. Why? No, I'm just curious. I just want to make sure. I know we went over this, but how did you take this? Can you just walk me through it? Just to make sure, like maybe there was a mistake, because mistakes, it's easy to make a mistake where somebody, oh, well, we misunderstood you. And so I carefully went through with my field techs to make sure and had them, in your own words, tell me how you took the samples. And like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, wow, great. Nope. They were taken exactly as directed. And so seeing numbers like that immediately, you say, how is that even possible? Because most people, I think, would say that if you can increase organic matter by 0.1% per annum, like you're on a good track. 0.5% per annum is seemingly impossible.
Yeah.
So,
Smiling
and look,
big time.
we're not out here to say we've done it definitively, but at the same token, when you get data back from a reputable lab and you've done it the way you're supposed to do it, and it's just like you've always done it, and something moves all of a sudden, we also don't want to dismiss that. And I mean, honestly, what do you think? Because, I like the old adage, if you're in the field and what you see in the field doesn't match what you read in the book, you throw the book out, right? Like field
Yeah.
observation trumps theory and etc. But would you say, from your experience, because I can speak to my experience, but my experience has been much shorter here. You've been here for at least 6 years managing this farm, and you've been here even longer than that. So you're familiar with those soils. Would you say that the change in the field is as marked as the change of that soil organic matter in the test?
Yeah, I think without a question. I mean, historically, if we had water on the field, the soils would be fairly soft, fairly, some good clay content, whatever. But the second you turned off water, I mean, you go 2 days without water and it's like bricks. I mean, I think, when you arrived here, Denver, I mean, you could go out there in this, field, we'd put all kinds of good stuff on, grown cover crops on, and you could knock on the ground and it sounded like you were knocking on a brick. You're not going to grab a handful of soil no matter what you wanted to do. And so over the last 2 years, we really moved. We'd been doing cover crops. We'd already transitioned to no-till, but what significantly changed was biological inputs. We'll talk more about obviously balancing of nitrogen and carbon, the teas and some of the foliars, and cutting off things like synthetic fungicides, and that kind of stuff. And so we saw a huge leap. I mean, you could go out into the field, especially a couple sections of the field, actually most of it, and it looked like we were worm farming. I mean, it was like sheet farming of worms. I mean, you could literally take a square foot or a square meter off, and you would be counting hundreds and hundreds of castings, literally layers of castings on the surface. And so, no question. And you could go out there when it was dry and you could still reach down and get soil, which we've never had before. And so, for sure, we saw physical structure change drastically in that process. But my faith was still weak that it was going to translate into organic matter. I'm thinking, okay, we got more biology,
For
structure,
sure.
pores, oxygenation in the soil. Hey, all that's better. But this was a very pleasant surprise.
So that's, yeah, to echo what you said. When I first arrived, I thought I knew what hard soil was, and then we went out to dig. I said, okay, I don't know what you qualify this as now, because I think we have some asphalt that I'm familiar with that's softer. And I mean, that's no dig. It's just like, wow, okay, well, this is a new level. What
Yeah.
are we going to do about this? And so, yeah, to see, that's why, as I've shared this with a few close people, they said, that can't be. And I'm like, no, I know. I could totally understand your response. It'd be mine as well, except I've seen it change in the field, and I can promise you, it feels like we moved fields. The soils are
Yeah.
no longer the way they were when we began.
Just to give a little anecdotal comparison to that, I had a friend in from Brazil. We got a brand new shovel. We went out and jumped on the shovel and broke the shovel in two, just to give an idea how hard the soil has been historically if it's dry. So yeah, there's no joking around. It's a totally different situation for sure.
So, as we began here, we back up about a year and a half now, from being on farm, and really discussing, like, putting everything on the table, because again, as you'll hear us talk about over and over again, we're not believers in silver bullets. We're believers in tools and management.
Sure enough.
And so the questions are obviously, what tools do we have at our disposal, and which should we be using? And so, immediately, one of those tools discussed was manures and compost. Should we be using manure? Should we be using composts? And we can access those, but again, like so many people, it's one thing if you have a feedlot just next door. Okay, there's
Hmm.
copious amounts of manure. It's one thing if you're within a close distance of a high quality compost facility. You know, that's not the case for us. Neither of those is the case. And so it's
No.
still a tool, but it becomes a less viable one. And honestly, not one of my favorite tools to begin with, because even so, those systems are taking animals and putting them in confined spaces and creating problems that you have to deal with. Ergo, the manures that involve a lot more of petroleum and things like that to move it. And so, but around that conversation, but manure and compost, they're ideal, right? Yes, but why? And that's what you were talking about, right? That
Hmm.
carbon to nitrogen ratio. And
Yeah.
so, as we're discussing this, like, yeah, okay, so, but what could we want manure, right? Yeah, we want manure for sure. What's manure? Well, it's nitrogen and carbon and organisms. So, but how could we do it otherwise? How about, what synthetic manure? Could we call it
Yeah.
that? Could we get
It
away
was
with that? And
interesting. I
so,
was, yeah, looking at a magazine, and there was an old advertisement, you know, from the beginning of the Haber-Bosch, Green Revolution era, and it literally was an advertisement saying, synthetic manure. And of course, you look at that now, and you look at the fields of, the Midwest or whatever that have been basically mined of carbon, and you kind of laugh at it. But it started me thinking, like, okay, what was their point? And obviously, adding nitrogen to the soil has not proven to improve the soil long term. Short term crop production, there's no question. I mean, you ask almost anyone in any crop category, and even if you talk to people in the organic field, their biggest struggle is, in many cases, after weeds. How do we get enough nitrogen in the system from a natural standpoint? And so I started thinking about that, and thinking about like cattle production. So it's very common in feedlotting for people to give food grade urea to cattle. And what are they doing? Well, they're doing it to increase the protein and obviously weight gains in cattle. And 6 hours or less from that, you can get that manure out and go out and put it on an organic field, and you've got nitrogen that was synthetic urea just hours ago. And so I was thinking about it, like, I wonder. And so as we began to look at how we were applying nitrogen, began to combine the nitrogen with a corresponding percentage um, of amines, but also with things like carbons. You match those nitrogen and carbons. All of a sudden, the fields began to change, and you think about it. You say, okay, well, now I'm no longer demanding carbon from my soil or from my cover crops or my root exudates to balance up the nitrogen that's being provided. Well, now what happens? And so that's where we kind of began to question, like, well, could there be something to the whole synthetic manure concept, just not the way it was laid out by the Green Revolution that we know? And so I think that kind of triggered some of the conversation we're having. What does that
Well, and
look
it's
like?
interesting because it can be a little look, it can be a little controversial because we ride a fine line
Sure.
between on one extreme conventional agriculture, I guess, and on the extremely conventional, and then on the other organic. And I think we share the same views in that, and that we're not dogmatic either way. But I know you've said it many times, and I couldn't agree more that healthy food shouldn't be reserved for the wealthy. Like healthy
For
food
sure.
should be
No
accessible
question.
to all people. And so then there's that challenge because trying to produce food, trying to produce high yielding crops, high quality crops in the organic system can be quite a challenge. For some people, for what they're doing and where they are and what inputs they have near them, it can be much more feasible. But for some people, it's just straight out nearly impossible. And so, not being bought into an ideology as much as the principles
Mhm.
that govern those, I think, is at Soilcraft what we constantly try and talk about is like we're about principles and less about practices, and practices will come from good paradigms and good principles. Um,
Yeah, and I think on that maybe Denver, there's a concept there, and like for me, I've given pushback to a bunch of my friends who are very dogmatic about the organic system, and they're like, "What are you talking about?" And I would just say, I'm not against the ideas. I think the ideas that led to people wanting the organic system were right for the right reasons. But recently, like for example, I was in Oregon and on an organic blueberry plantation. And they just told me straight up. They said, "Listen, we don't ever start any of our blueberry plantations as organic because we want to get the phosphates right. We want to get." And so the bottom line is they literally never set up an organic blueberry plantation from the scratch. It's all synthetic, all traditional, and then it's transitioned. And so if you're looking at that, you're saying, well, if you have to use a synthetic system to set up your plantation to be viable and then transition it, is this model really okay? And just maybe jumping back to maybe a biblical perspective, that whole concept of who can eat. I mean, I really believe that if we're going to follow a biomimicry model, a model that's based on a created order, that following that created order should lead us back to a place where all of God's children have access to food at a reasonable fee. And it shouldn't be harder for us when we follow the created order to produce more affordable food that's higher quality. It should be easier. And if the model we have now is spend more money, work harder, and less people can eat, is that a philosophy that we can wholeheartedly embrace? The ideas behind it, I absolutely. The idea is we should be getting rid of chemistry. We shouldn't be poisoning our food. That we need to take care of the environment. No question about that. No question at the heart of why it began, for me at least, it was in the right place. The question is, have we gotten to the point where we're greenwashing, where we're using it primarily as a marketing system that allows us to get more money from the people who have an excess of money, just to be honest, the people in the Western world. You go outside of that, you come to where we're at, and there's almost no organic market to speak of at
yeah.
all. And you know what the reason is? Because people just need money to eat. There isn't any excess capital. And so looking at that, for me, that was kind of the driving thing, of saying, hey, how can we look at finding a way where we can follow the heart principles, the intent of the organic system, but do it where people can afford to access it.
And what's that's spot on. And what's amazing is that I really believe a lot of the. I was just talking to someone about this the other day. Unfortunately, oftentimes we can focus almost immediately on something being maybe negative like urea, rather than realizing that part of the reason we have the more disruptive aspects of agriculture, fungicides, insecticides, herbicides, and the overuse of them is actually stemming back from the Green Revolution, from not the concept itself, but the missing piece of balancing the carbon with the nitrogen.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
you're able to affordably apply copious amounts of nitrogen, but in so doing, in pushing these plants unnaturally too hard, too much, too soon, imbalancing soils, too much concentration, and damaging the soil microbiome, then we end up with unhealthy plants. And as a result, then we have to come in with fungicides. And as a result, we have more weeds. And as a result, we need insecticides and nematicides to try and balance afterwards, because we've upset the balance on the front side. And so what we've seen through the years at Soilcraft, what we're seeing really displayed here in full, is when we balance those, when we remember that if we feed the soil feeds the plant. But nitrogen is a component of that. And absolutely we can use leguminous plants, and we do in cover crops. But when we're growing a crop for resale and we're trying to get yield, it has a high demand on the soil, both nitrogen, carbon, obviously hydrogen and oxygen coming mainly from our water sources. But so there's a demand on the system for that crop. And we do want to provide a high yielding, high quality, healthy, nutritious crop. But if we want to do that and build soils at the same time, let's be honest, if we're making withdrawals from our account of nitrogen and carbon for the crop, what's left over for the soil? How are we going to actually build that soil? We're debiting and we're mining. And that's what we've been doing, is mining our carbon, our organic matter, because we're adding only nitrogen, and we've been getting free carbon that's been stored throughout hundreds or thousands of years that we're debiting from that account and haven't been doing. And so obviously there's great ways to do that. But what we want to touch on is just our ability to grow healthy crops, yielding crops, and grow soil organic matter at the same time using synthetically derived nitrogen sources that we balance with labile carbon sources and stable carbon sources. When I say labile, that means things like molasses, like amino hydrolysate, like plant and animal hydrolysates, and stable ones like humates, etc. And so when we're putting those all together and balancing those to balance our nitrogen prospect, then we're able to see adequate yields and also appreciating soils. And that's why we're so excited, right, to see that organic matter move while we're still growing crops.
Well, one of the things along that line, if you talk about human biology, or you talk about compost piles, for example, and you look at the biology in those systems, they're very similar. If you look at a healthy biome for a compost pile, the human body, and the soil biology. And so if we're looking at that and we say, okay, soil organic matter, we used to think soil organic matter was, let's grow a cover crop and let's plow it into the ground so we get more of that in the ground. But as they began to do the research, of course, we know that the majority of organic matter in the soil is actually dead bug bodies, or living bug bodies, depending on the situation. It's what's tied up in the living system that's been going on. And so imagine for a second that you can take synthetic urea and you combine it with that carbon source and you put it in the soil. Well, now what you did with your cow, you got weight gains on your cow because you put urea into the feed system. You're able to do that in the soil, and instead of mining it, which is what we traditionally and historically see, you're actually turbocharging it because you're adding the correct portion of carbon, and you're adding foliars that increase the root exudates. Well, now the root exudates are useful because of why? They get into the bug bodies. So you're actually you're growing soil at an exponential rate, an unnatural rate, but in a natural way. It's we'll accept the manure. Well, we can create the manure from our underground livestock. I mean, you talk about Gabe Brown, and he'll always be talking about, well, are you taking care of your underground livestock? Well, if you use this system, I'm suggesting we're actually creating soil by feeding our underground livestock in the same way we'd feed a properly balanced nutrition to our above ground livestock. And so I think that's something that we have to think about. If you pull it back and take the immediate reaction of, what, you're going to put more nitrogen on, you think you're going to grow soil, what? Well, back it up and think about human health, think about animal health, think about a compost pile, your combinations of green and carbon matters. It works. You get more if you have more. And so if you can do that in a way that's non-mining, you're not needing to draw something out to balance, all of a sudden, I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah. And, as much as we can, again, it's not about silver bullets. And so, you've been growing cover crops, and we still grow cover crops as much as possible. We have living roots as much as possible. We're utilizing every solar hour we can so that we can capture sunlight and energy, put it into the
Yeah.
soil and exudates, grow above ground biomass, put it on top, keep our
Yeah.
mulch
Cover
blanket.
for
It's
sure.
the whole system. It's not
Yeah.
like, oh, all I need to do now is add urea with these labile carbon sources. No, that's not what we're saying. But we're saying it accelerates the progress from
Well,
the regenerative principles when practiced, right?
uh, well, we saw that. I mean, in the two pivots we're talking about, we had an issue with a stand of soybeans. And so we said, well, we don't normally till, but we're going to try doing a tillage pass and get a good stand of soybeans because we didn't have the right tool at the time. And, from everything we can see in the tests, it cost us 1% of our carbon compared to the field that wasn't touched. So we could do all the right combining of nitrogen, combining of carbon, but there are things that you can do that will erase your gain. So like you say, it's a system approach. You've got to be looking at cover, maintaining that air porosity in the soil so you're not becoming anaerobic. There's a whole bunch of things we need to do. But we've definitely seen movement. If we did the other ones and we didn't do this, we didn't see the gains we got. And so when we started adding the compost teas, the worm casting teas, getting rid of the fungicides, and adding the carbon to nitrogen balance, immediately that's when the explosion took place in the worm population and in the biology that created that carbon, because it wasn't plowed in. That carbon got there through biology. And so I think we have literally a case study side by side that you can
Which is
see that
incredible
situation.
because, again, too, we're saying, okay, as a result, if we choose to no-till, because we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing the benefits of the no-till, now that means we're using a herbicide instead of a tillage pass, which is a non-organic practice. And
Yeah.
it's a challenge because do we want to use the herbicide? No, we don't
No
want
way.
to use the herbicide. But the challenge is you're always asking the question, okay, so which is the lesser of two damages?
Yeah.
Do we till because we know what's going to happen, or do we the herbicide because we know what's going to happen? And I think the answer in each case, no matter the direction you go, is you know the downside, and we're going to do everything we can to mitigate that downside. If you have to till, well, we're going to cover that soil as soon as we're done. We must get and we
Totally.
did that. We
Mm-hmm.
tilled. We went out. We tried to get a stand, and we still the rains, the times, it couldn't have been worse. And so, but then you did the expensive thing and said, but we know we need a living root and we need cover. And so you made the choice to make an additional expense and plant sun hemp to do just that because we know
Yeah.
there are negative effects from tillage, and so that's what we do. But it's the same with the herbicide. So if we choose to go with the no-till method because we know the benefits from not disturbing the soil,
Mm-hmm.
then we know we need to mitigate the damages of those herbicides,
Right.
which we're doing. We're doing that through our microbial teas that we know reduce half-life of things like that and bolster plant health. We're doing that through foliar nutrition that allows us to add some key trace elements that may be tied up through some of those herbicides. And we're using biological controls to offset the use of fungicides because we know that can upset the balance in the soils as well. So just like anything, it's management, mitigate the downside. And we've done that and seen that. And that's why we're advocating for the proper use of tools for the augmentation and the mitigation of tools, not tying our hands behind our back, but
No.
looking
Yeah.
at all these things.
I'll just tell you, I mean, having looked at that experience close up recently, it in my mind is at least much easier to look at mitigation of the herbicide than of the physical structure destruction. Like it's harder to put the structure back in the soil, than it is to mitigate with biology some of the effects of some of the herbicides. I mean, even with the studies coming out now saying, hey, you can use biology to mitigate, the impacts of glyphosate residues, we're finding that biology is able to break down those things. And so if you know that, you can start to say, okay, do I want to use it? No. Should I use it as little as possible? Absolutely. But biology is kind of a trump card. It really impacts, mitigation in almost every area.
So, I think something that is worth visiting is this concept of organic versus inorganic. We know we know when we say organic, there is there is that certified organic that we're assuming we're talking about, right? Certified organic, which again we want to say we're grateful for. We're grateful for those who
Mm-hmm.
were committed to this, to say, look, we can't just do this without being transparent. We can't do this without
Yeah.
asking what are the damages here. And just because we have a tool that's solving this problem and has now, oh great, I had pests in my field, now I don't have pests in my field, problem solved. Like, wait, okay, that
Mm-hmm.
might be a solution today to save your
Yeah.
crop, but
Why
what's
were
the
they there?
resultant? We shouldn't just say, oh, problem solved, moving on. And so in no way am I or are we saying that that we don't value that. But if we look at organic versus inorganic, it takes me back to my college days or even high school, but looking at organic chemistry versus inorganic chemistry. And so what's the difference? I mean, generally we can say, well, one has carbon and one doesn't. I mean, technically we say it's carbon to hydrogen bonds, which still is a bit loose because we have things like hydrogen cyanide and aldehydes and some other um, and even hydrocarbons themselves, diamonds and diatoms. So there are some exceptions to that rule, but by and large, we say when it's carbon containing and that has carbon and hydrogen bonds, then it's organic, meaning living, and inorganic
Comes from
doesn't
life.
contain those. So, but interestingly enough, if you go back far enough into the 1800s, there was this movement um, that was called Vitalism, and it was kind of adopted or whatnot for quite a period before it was thrown into the bin. But it suggested that organic materials or anything that requires an organism to create that substance. And so you have urea, for instance, which in under those definitions was considered organic because it came through urine, for instance. Urea was a natural substance. But under those definitions, as soon as you take urea and you manufacture nitrogen through the Haber-Bosch process or something synthetic, now all of a sudden, oh, now it's not organic. But let's not forget, urea still contains carbon. And so, um, what do we do about that, organic versus inorganic? And I like the vitalism aspect because I really think it encapsulates what we're doing. Yeah, sure, there are times we're taking a synthetic source of nitrogen and we're complexing it, or even you can do that with trace elements simply through ionic compounds, positive, negative charges like amino acids, humic acids that will actually kind of form these superstructures and keep them encapsulated until used by living organisms. But then there's a whole other realm, which is where we use microbes themselves to actually synthesize, to use these ingredients, these synthetic raw ingredients, and through fermentation and digesting, they now convert inorganic ingredients into organic compounds, volatile acids and phenolics and these other things. And I really believe this is there's miles to go in research in this field. So that's something we've done quite a bit, is utilizing fermented sources of inputs that through a fermentation process are now become very much an organic compound. They may or may not have started out that way, but they're a building up. It's a reduction. And so, and we see that the difference between compost and ferments. Composts are highly oxidative and low energy, very stable, but ferments are the opposite. They go through a reducing process where hydrogen ions are added and small things become bigger, whereas in compost big things become small. And again, I'm not saying, oh, then this is better than compost. I'm saying they're two different tools and we can utilize them differently. But through microbial processes, through microbial metabolites, as it ferments, these things excrete what we know are PGRs and food for plants. But also we also know too, some of these microbial metabolites actually will increase the rate at which microbes divide. Whether that's through quorum sensing, I'm not sure. All that to say, when we can step back a bit and look at things principally and say, what are we really after here? We're really after trying to supply the best source materials at the best cost so that we can get the best results and we can actually build soil and appreciate soil. And, some might say, Denver, so what's different? What's different about this? Why are we all on about this and sharing this? And I would say one of the biggest differences has been the opportunity to work with you, Craig, because you said, like, I'm all in on this. on the principle, on the paradigm, on the concept. Like, I want to operate holistically, like holistic management, like Alan Savory talks about. This is our paradigm. So everything, all the decisions we make come back to this paradigm. And so I'm bought in a system way, and we're going to do it year after year. And the ability to do that, for instance, in these center pivots, to say, okay, no, everything we do is through this paradigm, and to do that year after year with the full program, including things like cover crops and no-till and grazing when we can, but also including these labile carbon sources, applying exogenous microbial food sources, exogenous microbial teas, etc. And then you stack that with the fact that we're in the tropics and our degree days are so much, and we get at least 2 cropping cycles for every 1 cropping cycle where I come from. I think as exciting as this is, we could say that where I come from in Eastern Washington State, it would take 2 to 5 or 6 seasons, 2 to 5 or 6 years to probably realize the same amount of progress, just because of the fact that we live in the tropics like we do. But it isn't a reason to dismiss it. It's just an exciting way to say, look, it does work, and we've been able to see it in an accelerated way. So stay the course.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing. So, like, I'm talking to a lot of people here who've struggled with the carbon numbers. I think there is a feeling that if you look at cold climates that have a freezing winter, that while you have less of a cycling time, what you did cycle, you retain easier. So in our case, we can cycle much more quickly, but if you're not retaining it, it goes away faster. And so the wonderful thing about that for those of us living in the warmer part of the world is if we do it right, I think we see evidence we can actually accelerate the production of living soil much faster than those in the Northern Hemisphere. The good news for those living in cold places, if you do it right for the months you have less, it's going away much slower. And so I think that's the reality is if you had the soils of Iowa and Indiana and you had them here in Zambia, and we did traditional methods like are being used in much of the field cropping in the Midwest, we wouldn't even have the organic carbon left that you guys have in those depleted soils, because we would have burned it up already, because our cycle time doing the wrong thing would have used it up quicker. But the cold leaves an opportunity to fix it, do it right, and reverse it, although more slowly, with a larger legacy load of carbon.
Oh, thanks. That's an excellent point. You're 100% right. The carbon cycle here is much faster. Like you say, we can sink it, but it is so hard to retain, so hard to hang on to. It wants to leave as almost as soon as it enters. And so retention is massively important. And that's why I think the one tillage pass we saw was so costly. It might be exaggerated here because it's so hard to retain. You look at a boreal forest, an extreme opposite of this. And like you say, it's slower to build, but it lasts. It's much harder to burn off. So that's a great point. I couldn't help but laugh. I'm sitting here looking at you talk about, for those of us in the warmer part of the world, and you're wearing a down vest.
It's warmer right here, let me tell you.
Yeah, exactly. Even though we get used to it. We get used to the warmth, and so we're
It's
finally
like
into
70
wheat
degrees.
season.
I got to get a down vest on,
Exactly. We're adapted organisms. No, so that's so to get to a bit to the nuts and bolts, because I think this is fascinating and exciting, but I know people are like going to be saying, "Great, okay, fine, but what does that look like?" And
what did you actually
that's
do?
exactly what is this magical thing that's happening, and so and to that we're going to do a series of videos based on that. I gave a presentation at our conference in January in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, about kind of our 8 principles, the 8 principles of our regen agronomy. And, it starts, in my mind, it starts with keeping that soil covered. You have to have the soil covered.
No question.
And so that's a basic, like, okay, that's obvious. And yet sometimes we struggle to cross that. And the reason it's so important is if that soil is not covered, there's no roof, there's no home for microbes. There's no cover over their head. The sun and the rain is going to pelt the soil and pelt the organisms. And so it's a principle based approach, but it starts with 2 things paradigmatically, which is feed the soil and the soil feeds the plant. and healthy plants resist pests and diseases. And so as we walk through that, it looks like keeping the soil covered. It looks like adding good minerals, mineral balance. There's no way we can overlook things like calcium, and adding stable carbon sources like humates. It looks like adding beneficial microbes in the best way you can afford or logistically do. It looks like feeding those organisms, right, exogenously. Is that a must? No, but it accelerates the process significantly. And then applying timely foliars at strategic points of influence throughout that crop's life, when we can make a difference, whether that's through trace elements or what we really focus on, which is applying biostimulants and plant foods that reduce plant stress. Because the plain truth of it is, plants are facing stresses all the time, and they don't have legs. They can't run away from trouble. They have to weather the storms, and so we got to reduce those stressors. So those are the principles and paradigms. But for us, what does that look like? What are some of the big changes that you could say in your words that you've made that, practically speaking, have made that difference? Things like molasses,
Yeah.
but not just molasses, amino acids, etc. What would you say has
Yep.
made the biggest difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one base thing we did is, yeah, we're doing cover crops. Yes, we're doing no-till. And I think those are critical. But yeah, adding with the urea or with the nitrogen source, adding a source of sulfur, adding a source of humates, adding a source of carbon, and in our case, that may be largely molasses because that's where we're near sugarcane country. For someone else, it's going to look like the available the available carbon that's in your area. And the other thing is putting that molybdenum. What you're really doing is you're looking at the recipe for nitrogen use efficiency, and you're going to create that application when you do your nitrogen or right after you do your nitrogen. You're applying that to balance out the nitrogen use efficiency, but then you're upping the carbon level so that you're not just making nitrogen use efficiency the thing, which can save you like 20% of your nitrogen use, but you're actually saying, I'm going to give a little extra because I don't want to mine what I've got. And so you're actually creating enough that you're actually creating a net positive in the soil. So I think that's number one. Number two, I think is the teas, the worm casting teas, the IMO teas, which indigenous microorganism teas. Well, I'm sure there'll be opportunity to talk about more. Using LAB, lactobacillus applications. I mean, if you look at those tests, the other thing that I think that was a bit shocking for me was the availability of phosphate that seemed disproportionate to the amount of phosphate we actually apply.
Yeah,
And I
that's right.
believe that's driven by a few things. By water treatment, I think it's also driven by the LAB's ability to free up nutrients and make them plant available, open the pore structure of the soil. So for me, it would be to do the worm casting and the IMOTs, add your molasses or your carbon sources with your balance of the nutrients with your nitrogen. And then if you're doing the other base things, you're providing living roots, you're managing those things. Those are huge. Yes, eliminating the fungicides made a big difference as well. But I believe if you did the two things the most, if you've already got the base in place, driving that nitrogen use efficiency plus carbon, and then adding these biologies, these IMOs, the diversity of biology, the lactobacilluses, and actually using yeast metabolites in the system. We used quite a bit of yeast metabolites in that, and that's not expensive to do, but it makes a huge difference, I believe, in that soil profile.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeast really gets overlooked. I mean, we talk about bacteria and fungi. Fungi, of course, is the hot topic. Like, everybody wants fungi. Oh, I've had bacteria, now I want fungi. And I'm not discrediting it. The power of fungi is massive, but we kind of get the flavor of the month. But poor yeast gets overlooked all the time, and yeast really is the ignition source. Like, yeast is the smallest soil organism, and it really kicks everything off after that. And that's, you talk about molasses, and there's many people within the regen space, I suppose you could say, that are really pretty doggish against molasses. And I know that's you asked me at first. Well, isn't that going to imbalance my soils? Isn't that bad? And
Yeah.
I said, it's probably over my pay grade. It's certainly over my qualification to say definitively yes or no. But all I know is, as we've used it throughout the years in combination with things like our fish hydrolysates and soy amino hydrolysates, and other biostimulants in our soil, gosh, we've seen incredible impact, and it's affordable. And so,
Yeah.
I say, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe over long term we'll start to see things become problematic. But I know what we saw in the bananas from using, I mean, at first we used the product that I've developed here on the farm, SBX. We had to start with just sourcing what we could get individual ingredients and using them kind of one at a time. And now I've been able to formulate it into a nice stable package, all combined
Totally.
together. But there's no question, like copious amounts of molasses for sure at the core. And what did we see in bananas this year? But incredible fungal growth, just
Yeah,
massive
for
fungal
sure.
growth. I mean, hyphae like we've never seen growing in banana fields.
And I kind of think that question is yes, molasses could be bad, and yes, it could be good. It depends on your soil. I think if you have dead soil and you dump a bunch of molasses on it, you're gonna just have a cap. You're gonna have a problem. But I think if you've started the biology, you're using the IMOs, you've gotten biology going again. Now you're able to fuel that along with your nitrogen uses and balance all that out. I think you'll never, my opinion is you'll never have a problem if the engine's running, but you can't use it as starter fluid. It has to be,
Well, and
you have to
frequency,
have
right?
biology to use it for sure.
It's like
Yeah.
frequency. Like, we're not going to go out there and put on 200 liters per hectare in one whack. Like, no,
No.
I mean, you'll kill what you have. Anytime we do
Yeah.
that, it's remarkable the impact of doing small amounts regularly over throughout the cropping season to really drive that in, and the importance of being able to balance that. I mean, we've been using all of these labile carbon sources at Soilcraft for years. And we usually have each of our suppliers is saying, just use more of just our thing. And
Yeah.
we found that when we blend these multiple sources together, we have, it's not
Yeah,
1 + 1 + 1 + 1 equals
for
4, but
sure.
it's rather like 0.2 + 0.2 + 0.2 + 0.2 equals 4. That we get a greater output with a lesser input. So we reduce our costs, we reduce our volume when we do that. And even you look at nutrient auger sources and microbes. Those microbes are always going to prefer a nutrient source that has amino acids as opposed to just carbohydrates. And so, as best we can, we balance those and try and balance
Hmm.
nitrogen or protein sources along with carbohydrates and lipids. If we can serve that as a balanced meal, and oddly enough, it's not that different from our dinner plate. Like, our dinner plate should have a
Yeah.
balance of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, along with our micronutrients. And so we need to feed the soil a balanced diet as well as we are. And so that's what we've over time here we've been able to do, and we've been doing it at Soilcraft in the States for years now, where we build our own soil primer, soil food, whatever you call it, soil stimulus, of this balance of these nutrients, including things like pyroligneous acid and kelp and other biostimulants that kick up soil life so that we can stimulate those T's when we put them down.
Maybe just to go off on something I'm excited about. So we're about to go back into wheat season again. It's my favorite. I mean, I love wheat. Denver grew up with wheat. I'm new to the farming, and just wheat's got so many, factors that impact the end yields and stuff. And you can get quite technical with it. And anyway, I love it. And so, recently we were trying different biological seed dressings. And Denver says, hey, let's do some pot trials. Let's get the soil from the pivot, the exact pivots we're going to use. Let's do pot trials. And to our surprise, something we've used in the past couple of years that's biological, that I love to use, is not the right thing for a seed dressing. But something else is, and I think one of the exciting things we've seen in the pot trials, and just going to spoil it here, Denver, but is the impact of calcium and in some cases micronized gypsum in connection with things like Johnson Sioux compost, and in connection with What maybe I'm most excited about is the crop biolife product, because when you have the ability to use a plant-based product, put it on the into your crop and multiply the amount of stomata in your plant, there's no question you're going to get more root exudates because there's more available in your soil. And what does that do? That further drives the opportunity to see soil growth because you're feeding more bugs and there's going to be more bodies. So, I'm excited to see that next step. And I think if you haven't looked at that, look at it. I think the research is compelling. So we're beginning to use that in wheat. We're also beginning to use that in bananas. And I think that's an exciting opportunity to really juice your crop in a natural way.
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. We've seen the same things back in the States at Soilcraft, with our newly labeled Vigor Carb, and the impact, the output we have using a good seed treatment like this is just unbelievable. The cost to benefit ratio is stupid. There is nothing like it. It's
nothing cheaper for the impact, no question.
There's nothing cheaper for the impact to give that a start. It's better than naked seed, and I'll tell you, it's much better than the brightly colored seed as well.
Yeah,
which is even more exciting. But well, we need to draw this to a close because we set out to do a 25-minute podcast and we're at 50 minutes, and it's really not surprising. we need to do more of these, but thanks for joining us. And just in closing, and we'll do our best to have more of these podcasts coming out so that we can get a little more into the nuts and bolts. But it's just been amazing to see that when you stay the course, when you use the 5 regenerative principles as best as you can, when you do everything you can to use all those regenerative practices, but then in addition to that, you maximize what you can with those principles, that if we feed the soil, it feeds the plant, and healthy plants resist pests and diseases. Like I'm telling you, it works. It just works. But you have to stay the course, and you cannot piecemeal it. I've had so many results, like so many times I can tell you where we're nearly there, and I understand it because as a producer, you're making your own choice. This is your tail on the line, and you've got to look the banker in the face. And so I get it. But every instance I have ideal results is when we stay true to the whole system, when we do it as a system approach management with these tools, and they differ from farm to farm, but when we stick with it, these are the results we see. And this is unbelievable. I've never seen anything like this, appreciated organic matter in such a short period of time. But it's amazing because it's not like this is a wild idea. This is from hundreds, if not thousands, of research papers telling us that this is what happens. Reductionism at its finest, but compiling all of those individual reduced pieces and finding a way to put them together as a system, and we have a magnanimous output. And why shouldn't we? It's not fairy tales. It's not based on hopes and wild ideas. It's based on hard science that's been done now for decades. But when you put it together and you do it as a system, you get good results.
And I think with that, the other exciting thing for me is sometimes you see suggestions of solutions that are hard. There's not one of the things that we've done that's not scalable. We could roll this out to 10,000 hectares, and it's completely practical. And so that's some of the issues. You look at composting at scale for 10,000 hectares, or you look at some of these things. You just say, I don't know how I can do that viably. And the great thing is this is all scalable.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent point, because that's usually the first rebuttal I get. You talk about the results, and the first thing is, I got too many hectares. I can't put this across 1,000, blah, and understandably so. But you're right. That's what these things are scalable, which is amazing. And, and we stand on the shoulders of great people. Even, you briefly touched on it, and it's an incredible solution, on-farm solution. If guys are interested in it, people like Chris Trump, who have done incredible work to scale something like Korean natural farming, which has been around for ages, and to bring it to scale. Maybe not 100% everything about it, but taking every aspect that can possibly be scaled and scaling that. And so, and also reverse. We're more to come on that, but we've also done the reverse of that, which is take these practices that we're now having success with, and then we're now applying them to smaller scale, to intensive cropping systems. Even here in Zambia, we're applying them to intensive cropping systems like tomatoes and cabbage and other things like that. So anyways, thanks. That's a great point, and thanks for joining us. If you guys have specific questions for us about this, please reach out. Go to our website, email us, reach out to us, and leave comments below so that we can respond to those. I would love for participation for you guys to hammer us with your hard questions. Well, what about this? How do you do that? And then we can do a follow-up podcast. But we do our best to come out here and tell you what's off the top of our mind that's exciting us. But there's nothing better than a conversation and for you to be a part of that. So please give us your questions, and we'll follow up with an answer session.
And maybe we can put in the show notes the carbon to nitrogen ratio with nitrogen and the things that you can package with it to help balance out the burn.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We'll definitely do that. We'll include many things about carbon to nitrogen ratio, including, I think it's we know with bacterium it's a 3-to-1, a 3-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, and I think in soils they really want you to see ideally upwards of 26-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, which just tells you how much carbon the system really needs. And the truth is, if we prioritize things like carbon and calcium as we prioritize nitrogen, we would have a different picture. And so while we've talked a lot about nitrogen here, I think some might be saying, well, we know that's important. But in this space, sometimes we forget that we can combine those two and do it responsibly. And that's just what we're seeing. We're seeing when we combine those two, we're able to make synthetic manure, if you will, for lack of a better term. If somebody has a better term, I'm all ears. So anyways, thanks so much for joining us.
Actual promise to reality.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll see you again. Hey, thanks for tuning in and watching our content. We really appreciate you and appreciate you watching our videos. Please like and subscribe if you like what you're seeing here. Also, look down in the description down below for our website, a link to our Regen Agronomy podcast, and our phone numbers and email, etc. Reach out to us, please, if you want to know more about the content you see here in the videos.